Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first in this current webinar series from Ofcom, providing an introduction to the Online Safety Act and our Protection of Children consultation, which was published just a couple of weeks ago. It's a really big moment in our implementation as the new regulator for the Online Safety Act, and it follows on hot on the heels of our illegal harms consultation, which we started in autumn last year. That consultation is now closed, but our Protection of Children consultation is a really important part of our work and a major milestone, we think, in national and international online safety. So we're looking forward to talking to you about it today. We know that we have many guests from industry, and our focus is to help bring the duties to life and help services respond to our consultation meaningfully and think about the steps they can take towards practical implementation and meeting their duties in the future. But we do have guests from other parts of the community interested in this space, certainly from research, from civil society, so we hope you'll find this useful as well. In terms of housekeeping, we are going to spend about half of our hour today going through a presentation on the consultation. We are going to focus on a bit of an overview and a few key elements of the consultation, including the child access assessment duties. But I would just like to flag that we have two further webinars in this series. The second will be focused on content that is harmful to children and on our assessment of risks across the market and the risk assessment guidance that we've published in draft form. That's on the 3rd of June. And then the third webinar will focus on the codes of practice and the protective measures that we expect services to take in future. And that's on the 6th of June. So we may funnel some of your questions into those webinars if they're not so relevant to the team presenting today. Speaking of questions, you should be able to see a Q&A tab in Microsoft Teams here. Please feel free to post questions in the chat, and when they are published, you will be able to upvote by adding a thumbs up or similar to those questions which are published. If you do that, that will help us see which questions are most of interest to those in the room. So please do upvote as we go and as those questions appear. I think that's pretty much all I need to say. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Yep, I'm going to introduce Almudena in a moment to talk through our overall approach to online safety and our implementation timeline. We'll provide an introduction to the content of the Protection of Children consultation. We'll touch on how to respond to that consultation and what kinds of responses will be most useful, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions. I think that's everything I need to say, so I can hand over to Almudena. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ali. And thanks for joining us today. As you all know, we published our proposals on the protection of children on the 8th of May, and that consultation is now open until the 17th of July, and we are really keen to hear as many voices and feedback as possible. I'll talk later about how, my team will talk about how to engage with the consultation, but also the timeline and how things overall come together. But I want to, first of all, take a bit of time, if we can go to the next slide, please, to talk about what's our overall objective with all these different regulatory products that Ali was talking about, and how we expect to drive real change and real improvements for users' online safety in the UK, and in particular for children's online safety. So our objective under the Act is to ensure that services have the necessary systems and processes in place to assess the risk that their services pose on users, and in particular children, and then to take the actions required to minimize the harms. So from our perspective, in terms of our steps and the roles, we are in the early stages of setting up the regulatory regime. So that's the first step here, establishing the standards, publishing the whole regulatory regime that will underpin the specific obligations on companies. And that's the purpose of today, is to talk specifically about the requirements and the proposals in relation to protection of children. But that comes in a wider system that we are setting up to ensure that we are driving improvements in the industry. So we are also establishing supervision operations. So some of the largest and riskiest companies in the sector will be supervised, and that will allow us to continue to monitor how the industry is responding, but also looking at compliance across the board, including from the support to ensure compliance from those that are smaller and medium size in the industry, but that might still pose high risk to users. That kind of like builds also with the enforcement and ensuring that we hold companies to account, and we will not hesitate to enforce against companies that are not meeting the requirements to protect users, and in particular children. And under the Act, we have extensive powers to fine companies, but also we want fundamentally as well to work with the industry to ensure that users, and in particular children, have better experience. And that is exactly the purpose as well of the consultation and today, to ensure that as many in the industry understand and engage with our processes and are already taking notice and moving forward their systems and processes to meet our expectations. So if I can move to the next slide, please. So the focus under the Act, based on the priorities established by government and Parliament, we have developed a set of 4 target outcomes that for us provide the overarching framework and the overarching objectives of what we want to drive overall. So the first one is around governance and risk management. This is a key plank of what we think will drive the required change in the sector and will deliver impact for users, especially for children. So a lot of our measures under the legal harms proposals, but also the protection of children, focus on improving the risk, the governance and risk management of companies. The second aspect of it is safety by design, ensuring that services have trust and safety measures, and that actually design safer with the safety of users and in particular of children in mind. The third category is around choice and user empowerment, so making sure that users are aware of what they can do and how and what to expect from companies when it comes to safety online. So for example, being able to be in control of the content that they see, or how do they interact with one another, and the ability to report harmful content. I need to stress here that user empowerment is not about passing on the responsibility of safety onto users. The responsibility very much under the regime lies on companies to ensure that they deliver safety and safer experiences for users. But we believe, and in our engagement with children, for example, is very clear that they also want to have the tools to be more in control of their online experiences. And the final plank is transparency and trust. So we want to make sure that we shine a light on safety measures, we highlight good and poor practice, and we drive greater trust in the sector, including also being much more transparent about our own regulatory approach and how we go about engaging with companies, our research and our engagement with users as well. So overall, this framework will deliver, we strongly believe, safer lives online in the UK. If I can now move to the next, please. Just in terms of the implementation timelines, these are very tight as required by the law and also as required by the urgency of the subject matter that we have in hand. So when it comes to the Phase 2, which is the child safety duties and duties to prevent children from accessing pornographic content, which is the middle plank here. The timelines kicked off with the consultation on the highly effective age assurance requirements for providers of pornographic content, commercial providers of pornographic content, and has now been followed by the consultation that we published, as I say, on the 8th of May for wider measures to protect children online. Going forward, we will be publishing the final statement of the consultation on the duties on protection of children in April 2025. I get my years right, and that is 18 months. The statutory duty is to publish the final statement 18 months after the passing of the Act. So as I say, that would be in April 2025. And for that, just to acknowledge, we have quite a demanding time frame for consultation. So our current consultation will close on the 17th of July, but that is because we are really trying to work towards a publication of the duties in April 2025. Prior to that, we will be publishing our final guidance on age verification for pornography providers, and also prior to the April deadline, we will be publishing and finalizing our children's access assessment guidance, which is the first requirement when it comes to the child safety duties. So that will be done prior to laying the final documents with the requirements in law. So if we can now move to the next slide. I'm going to now focus specifically on what we published on the 8th of May with the requirements on companies to protect children online. I want to spend a bit of time talking about how the consultation in early May, which is the one that we are talking about now, and is at the top of this slide, fits with the other regime, the other planks of the regime. So that's the illegal harms codes of practice and Part 5 guidance. And to be clear that when we talk about protection of children online, the consultation that we are talking about now and we publish in May is very specifically about children, but children will be protected as a result of the wider set of measures that we are published under the illegal harms and the Part 5 guidance. So the protection of children is at the core of everything that Ofcom is doing. So for example, when it comes to illegal harms, any measure to protect users from fraud or terrorism will actually also be there to enhance the protections of children, and in particular when it comes to protecting children from child sexual exploitation and abuse, which is covered very directly in the illegal harms codes of practice. The Part 5 guidance that we published for consultation in December, and we are currently analyzing the responses, also bears a lot of the work and the foundational work when it comes to protection of children that is very much addressed at commercial porn services and the requirements to implement highly effective age assurance, which also then feeds into the wider measures that we are proposing in the protection of children. But when it comes to this specific consultation, the focus is to ensure that children are prevented from being exposed and experiencing suicide, self-harm, and eating disorders content, as well as pornographic content, and they are protected from wider categories of harmful content like violent content, hateful content, and content that promotes harmful substances and challenges. So that's what we are going to be focusing today. If I can go to the next slide, please. And just very quickly to remind us all of what are the steps that services need to follow when it comes to meeting the requirements to protect children under the Act. So the first step that companies in scope need to follow is to carry out a children's access assessment to assess whether the service is likely to be accessed by children. So this is the purpose of today's seminar, and where we are going to be zooming in is this children's access assessment in particular, and my colleague Louise is going to talk us through that. If a service is likely to be accessed by children as per the outcome of the children's access assessment, then services will need to carry out a children's risk assessment, which is similar and builds on the illegal harms risk assessment, but is specific to establish and to assess the risks that the service pose onto children. And that will be the purpose of the seminar on the 3rd of June. And if you haven't signed up to that one yet, I encourage you all to do it. And then the third step will be to take safety measures to tackle the risks that have been identified. And for that, under the Act, we need to publish as Ofcom codes of practice with specific measures to help companies understand how to meet those duties and mitigate the risks to children. And that is what we also publish for consultation under the code of practice. And that will be the focus of the meeting on the 6th of June. Again, I encourage you all to join us for that conversation. So once companies implement those safety measures and to address the risk, they actually need to keep those risk and safety measures under review to ensure that their risk is properly managed and mitigated. So those are the 4 steps under the Act that companies need to carry out, and what we'll be discussing with you in detail through this webinar series. Next slide. So most of you will be familiar with what are the specific requirements under the Act, but I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the requirements very quickly. So the first step is the core duties for services likely to be accessed by children, and that includes user-to-user services and search services. As I said, have a duty to carry out the children's access assessment to establish if they are in scope, and if they are in scope, they need to carry out the risk assessment. And then following from that risk assessment, user-to-user services will have a duty to use systems and processes to prevent children from encountering PPC and to protect children in age groups deemed as at risk from encountering priority content and non-designated content. For search services, the duty is slightly different, so that is a duty to use systems and processes to minimize the risk of children encountering primary priority content, and non-designated content. You have below on that slide the categories and how those categories are defined under the Act. I will pause very briefly on non-designated content, because this is content which presents a material risk of significant harm to an appreciable number of children in the UK. But the Parliament did not go into the detail of how or what type of content will qualify as non-designated content. As part of our consultation, we are establishing a methodology for what might qualify as non-designated content, and we are proposing that body image content and depressive content should be non-designated content. So we are consulting on the extent to which body image content and depressive content meet the standard and the definition of presenting material risk to a significant number of children in the UK. So moving on to the next slide, just to give you a bit of a sense of the components of the consultation. The consultation is vast. It covers many regulatory products, and we've done our best to respond to some of the feedback that we received in relation to illegal harms to make it a bit more succinct and accessible. So the volume 1 covers the overview, the scope and the approach to regulation, and we also have published a 25-page summary of the overall child protection duties and our approach and proposal. So if you haven't yet, I think that is a very good entry point to the consultation. And then the different volumes cover the different regulatory products. So volume 2 is dedicated to our children's access assessment guidance. Volume 3 covered the causes and impact of harm to children, which covers in turn 2 regulatory products. One is the Register of Risk, which is the compendium of all the evidence that we have gathered that comes to show the prevalence and the impact of the harms to children along the categories identified in the Act. And then the guidance on content harmful to children, which goes content type by content type, defining how Ofcom interprets content to be over the line of what we would consider to be harmful to children, or indeed under that line. And again, that is as well out there for consultation, and we'll be very grateful for views on that. Volume 4 focuses on assessing the risk of harm to children, so all the documentation that will help services carry out the risk assessment. And there we have 2 regulatory products, the Children's Risk Assessment Guidance, as well as the Children's Risk Profile. And the final volume, volume 5, focuses on the Children's Safety Code. So that is the code of practice to help services understand what measures they need to implement to meet their duties. Next slide, please. I think I'm now passing on to Louise, who's going to talk to us about what the Children's Access Assessment is there to do and how we are proposing to interpret it. Thanks.
Thank you. Please could you go on to the next slide? So yes, I'm here to talk about children's access assessments, and that is the process for determining whether a service is likely to be accessed by children in the wording of the Online Safety Act. And we've published draft guidance for services as part of our consultation, Annex 5, which explains how we think services should go about children's access assessments. In volume 2, we set out some of our policy positions on children's access assessments and some of the evidence behind those. So all Part 3 services, all user-to-user and search services need to carry out at least one children's access assessment. And as Almudena explained, it's a gating function for working out which services are in scope, and those services that are likely to be accessed by children will need to do children's access assessments in addition to their illegal content risk assessments, and implement the appropriate safety measures for them, which are set out in our draft children's safety codes. Now, I just said at least one children's access assessment. Some services are going to have to carry out more than one. In particular, services that conclude they're not likely to be accessed by children will need to keep that under review and take another look every year. And there are also other scenarios where services will have to do them more frequently, which are all covered in our draft guidance. All children's access assessments need to be recorded. We explain in our draft guidance what that means, and we've provided a suggested template checklist that services can use if they want to record the outcome. There are two components of children's access assessments. First of all, is it possible for children to access a service? And second, is the child user condition met? I'll go through both of those stages in just a moment. Some services may only need to do stage 1. Some services will need to do both, but the process should be relatively straightforward for most services. Could you go to the next slide, please? So the Act says that services should only conclude it is not possible for children to access a service if they're using age assurance, with the result that children are not normally able to access the service. The Act doesn't explain what kinds of age assurance services should be using in that context, unlike in other areas where it specifies that age assurance should be highly effective. We think that only highly effective age assurance can secure the desired outcome here, which is that children are not normally able to access the service. So we're proposing that for the purposes of children's access assessments, age assurance should be highly effective. Next slide, please. So as to what highly effective means in this context. So we published some separate guidance as Annex 10 of the consultation, which goes into a bit more detail about what highly effective age assurance is. There is also our Part 5 guidance that Almudena mentioned, which is aimed at pornography providers who have different obligations, but the approach to highly effective age assurance and what it means is consistent across the piece. So the effectiveness of age assurance depends very much on how it's implemented. And we've proposed 4 criteria that services should look at to establish whether or not any age assurance they are using is highly effective. So those are technical accuracy, so how a method performs under lab conditions with regard to establishing the age of a user. Second, robustness, the degree to which those lab conditions are replicated in the real world. Reliability, so the degree to which the outputs of a method are reproducible and derived from trustworthy evidence. And fourth and finally, fairness, so the extent to which the method used can minimise or eliminate bias and potential for discrimination. And in the guidance, we've set out steps for what each of these 4 criteria mean in a bit more detail. Services should also just ensure that the process they are using doesn't exclude adult users from accessing legal content. And finally, it's important that providers have effective access controls in place to prevent any users they identify as children from accessing the service. So it's not just enough to just identify children, you also have to keep them off to establish that any age assurance you're using is highly effective. Next slide, please. So it depends on the way any one method is implemented. Nothing is inherently highly effective, but we have provided some examples in our various pieces of guidance of types of age assurance that could be highly effective, including hard ID verification and facial age estimation. There are some methods that are not capable of being highly effective, notably self-declaration. So we don't just rely on what people tell us about how old they are, and debit cards that could be used by under 18s. Next slide, please. So going on to stage 2 for services that don't have highly effective assurance in place, they will need to establish whether the child user condition is met. That's a provision in the Act with 2 criteria, and it is met if a significant number of children are users of the service and or the service is of a kind likely to attract a significant number of children. So if one or both of those criteria is met, then the child user condition is met and the service is likely to be accessed by children. The Act's very clear that this bit of the assessment is about who is actually using the service and not who it's targeted at. Our evidence shows that services that aren't necessarily targeted at children are nevertheless likely to attract children. We're proposing to interpret significant number in a very context-specific way, because the variety of services and scope of the Act is large. children's access assessments are going to look very different for different services. And we're proposing to interpret significant number as a number that's material in the context of the service in question. So depending on the service and the context in which it's operating, that could be a relatively small number, or a relatively small percentage of children could still be significant based on the potential for harm, for example, and the risk to children on that service. For the same reason, we're not proposing quantitative thresholds, because different assessments for different services will look very different. Next slide, please. So service can start with either of the criteria. So whether there's actually a significant number of child users, or whether the services of a kind likely to attract significant numbers of children. We think it could be difficult to accurately count the number of users and the number of children on a service for services that aren't using highly effective age assurance. So for many services, it's likely to be easier to start with the second criterion. So what does the service look like? Is it of a kind likely to attract children? And we've suggested 4 broad groups of factors. We go into those in a bit more detail in the draft guidance. And in the consultation, we've presented some of the evidence behind this, behind what we know about services and how children use them. So broadly, a service that benefits children, whether it helps them with their homework, helps them stay connected with their friends. The content of the service, so is it the kind of thing that children like? And that could be gaming, entertainment. Maybe there's some overlap there with the first category. So what are children accessing the service for? Why do they want to look at the content that's on there? Third, the design of the service. So is it visually appealing to be engaging to children? And finally, the business model. Services that are targeting children, so for example, through their advertising, their marketing strategies, may be likely to attract significant numbers of children. But as I've noted, that the converse isn't true. Services that aren't targeted at children may still attract children. So the draft guidance we published includes some case studies for different types of services. They talk through the process and the different factors that these services might consider in order to reach their conclusion. But as I noted before, it will be very specific to individual services. So both the factors that we've suggested and the case studies are only indicative. Services that conclude that the child user condition isn't met will need to collate and record the evidence that they've used to arrive at this conclusion. Services that conclude the child user condition is met, so they conclude they are likely to be accessed by children, they don't need any further evidence. They can just record the outcome of the children's access assessment and then move on to the next stage, which will be children's risk assessments. So that is all from me, and I encourage everybody online to have a look at our draft guidance, both on children's access assessments and highly effective age assurance. So thank you.
Thanks, Louise. I'm just going to take people through now how to engage with the consultation and provide a response. So if you can go on to the next slide, please. This briefly goes through our approach, Ofcom's general approach to consultations. So as a public body, we consult on decisions that we make to ensure that people affected and those affected by any proposals have the opportunity to present their view. And it's a way to gather evidence and refine our decision making. We usually publish responses to consultations on our website, and we do that usually after the consultation period is ended, so that everyone who is interested can see other people's views. After the consultation, we will make our decisions and publish a statement, as Almudena has mentioned, explaining what we are going to do and why, and we will show in that how respondents' views have helped to shape our decisions. We are an evidence-based regulator, and in responding to the consultation, it is really helpful to us if stakeholders can provide evidence and reasoning to support your views. Next slide, please. So how to navigate our proposals. So in terms of navigating the documents themselves, we feel it is important that our consultation document is thorough and contains all the details in our proposals. And that's why it is a bit of a lengthy document. But we also understand that our proposals must be accessible to the full range of stakeholders. So because of that, then we have produced a summary document, which Almudena has mentioned. This provides this provides materials to help stakeholders navigate our documents. We have an a glance document which provides a summary of our proposed codes and measures and who they apply to. And also we have produced a 25-page summary of the consultation. In addition to that, we've got quick guides on our website to risk assessments and to the codes. The links to all of these will be shared with you in an email after this webinar. But for detail, the 5 volumes in our consultation will explain our proposals in full, and in the annexes you'll be able to find the drafts of the CAA that Louise has just mentioned, as well as the codes of practice and the risk assessment guidance. We have also started to produce short, accessible guides for the wider online safety regime, and we're working on more resources for whenever the legal harms duties begin. If you would like, we would like our resources to be as helpful as possible, so we're doing research with end users to shape our services and materials. If you would like to participate or to shape those resources, please do let us know after in our follow-up email. And you can also sign up for updates on our regulations, including future consultation and policy updates. Next slide, please. So yes, hopefully everyone has seen this page on our website already, but this is our consultation page for protecting children. You would see where to find it on our website, and also highlighted is the summary of our consultation. And then on to the last slide, please, or second last slide. So then how do you respond to the consultation? So the summary materials can help identify areas of interest, but the main document contains the detail, as I said, on the responses. We do encourage you to use our web form to respond to the consultation and submit it to protectingchildren@ofcom.org.uk with any submitting information or supporting information or evidence from your response. Using the web form does help us. It makes it easier for us to process the responses and gives us more time to incorporate responses into our decision making. So if you can use the web form, we would urge you to do so. As has been mentioned a few times already, the deadline for responding is the 17th of July. We're going to be running 2 other follow-up webinars, has also been mentioned, onto different aspects of our proposal. So this was just mainly covering the children's access assessment. So our second webinar is on the 3rd of June. That will be an introduction to content harmful to children and the children's risk assessment guidance. And the 3rd webinar is on the 6th of June, and that will be an introduction to the draft children's safety codes. And then just on next steps. If we're going to have questions session now after this, so any questions, please post them in the chat, and please do send your responses in by the 17th of July.